in memory of Professor Gail Omvedt. The lecture will be delivered by Professor Kalpana Kannabiran on reading Gail Omvedt. Before I formally invite Professor Kannabiran, I would like to request Professor Puspenj, Chairperson, TISS Patna Center, to pay tribute to Professor Gail Omvedt, and after that we will start the proceeding. Professor Puspenj.
Okay. Friends, more than a month has passed since Gail Omvedt passed on 25th August this year at the age of 80. Gail Omvedt was a powerful voice in the anti-Brahminical and anti-patriarchy struggles, both in academics as well as in grassroots activism. She, along with her teacher, Lerner, brought the works and thoughts of Phule and Ambedkar alive to the larger world of academia in India and outside. Gail Omvedt was born and brought up in America. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 1973, for which she researched on the non-Brahmin movement of Phule in Maharashtra. That dissertation was published in 1978 as a book entitled Cultural Revolt in a Colonial Society, the Non-Brahmin Movement in Western India, 1873-1930. Gail Omvedt married Dr. Bharat Patankar and lived in a village Kasegaon in Sangli district of Maharashtra. Perhaps this also helped her remain grounded throughout her life. In 1983, she got Indian citizenship. Gail Omvedt truly believed in combining theory and practice. She maintained close association with grassroots movements, anti-caste movements, women liberation movements aimed at changing the relations of production centered around material issues of land, water, and forest rights. She emphasized on the access of land to women, women's own understanding of the relationship between land, water, and ecology, and how class issues were pertinent within women's movement as certain groups of women were more vulnerable than others. Along with Bharat Patankar and her mother-in-law Indutai Patankar, she founded Shramik Mukti Dal and was also actively associated with Stri Mukti Sangathan Chalwal. She held several positions in academia, though she never had a full university job. She held Dr. Ambedkar Chair Professor at NISWAS in Odisha and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Chair of Social Change and Development at IGNOU. She was a senior fellow at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in New Delhi, visiting professor at the School of Social Justice, University of Pune, visiting faculty at Center for Social Studies, Surat, where I served for some time, and a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Simla. Gail Omvedt was a prolific writer. She authored more than 25 books and wrote several scholarly papers. At the same time, she was a committed public intellectual who contributed in newspapers, wrote pamphlets, booklets, and reports. She was also a chronicler of the literature and worldview of the numerous people's spiritual leaders who were widely popular among the working class masses and whose works critiqued the Brahminical practices and idea of God. To name a few of her publications, particularly which I have selected 5, which I felt are more representative of her work. One is We Shall Smash This Prison, Indian Women in a Struggle. The second is Reinventing Revolution, New Social Movements in India. Third, Dalits and the Democratic Revolution, Dr. Ambedkar and the Dalit Movement in Colonial India. Fourth, Dalit Visions, the anti-caste movement and Indian cultural identity. And fifth, Seeking Begumpura, the social vision of anti-caste intellectuals. And I would advise everyone, those who have not read Gail Omvedt's writings, or have partially read, at least read all these 5, and particularly the last one, which is quite unique in its own way, and there's very cheap edition of this book is available on Amazon. It's published by, I think, Namanya. So what Braj Mohan Mani, author who was Gail Omvedt's friend, has written in his tribute to her, best summarizes her views. He writes, and I quote, blending history with praxis, Omvedt brought together diverse liberating aspects of Marxism, feminism, and Ambedkarism, and broke new ground in understanding Indian society. Gail Omvedt has left a vast legacy of writing, which will continue to inspire, guide, and provide material for generations of researchers and also activists who dream of a society which is free from caste, class, and patriarchy, and a society where human dignity and communal harmony prevails. Let's celebrate her life and work. On behalf of the Patna Center of Tata Institute of Social Sciences, I pay my homage to Gail Omvedt. Shashank.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Pushpin. Now I would like to invite Professor Kalpana Kanabiran is the former Regional Director, Council for Social Development, Hyderabad, which she headed from 2011 to 2021 until a few months back. She works at the intersection of sociology, law, and gender studies. She is a co-founder of Asmita, Resource Center for Women, Sikandrabad. She has also taught at Nalsar University of Law, Hyderabad from 1919 to 2009. In the past 2.5 decades, she has researched and written in the areas of sociology of law, social movements, gender studies, disability studies, and jurisprudence, especially focusing non-discrimination and criminal law. Trained as a sociologist and as a lawyer, she has combined research, teaching, activism, pro bono socio-legal counseling, and rights advocacy in her work. She is co-author of the recently published Gender Regimes and the Politics of Privacy, a feminist reading of Puttaswamy versus Union of India, 2021. Some of her other published works include Tools of Justice, Non-Discrimination in the Indian Constitution, Representing Feminist Methodology, Interdisciplinary Explorations, which she has co-authored, Violence of Normal Times, Essays on Women's Lived Realities, Women and Law, Critical Feminist Perspective, again co-edited, and Challenging the Rules of Law, Colonialism, Criminology, and Human Rights in India, which she has co-edited. She was the recipient of Amartya Sen Award for Distinguished Social Scientist in 2012. She has been a member of expert group on the Equal Opportunities Commission, Government of India, and a General Secretary of the Indian Association for Women's Studies. She has also served as a member of Executive Committee of the International Sociological Association from 2014 to 18. So now I would like to invite Professor Kalpana to start her lecture. Professor Kalpana.
Thank you very much, Shashank, and thank you also to my good friend Pushpin for this invitation to speak today. Almost soon after Gail passed away, I received a request from an online magazine asking me to write a tribute to her. And that is one kind of writing that I have never done. I have never written remembrance pieces. I've never written obit articles, and I have never written tributes immediately after people have passed on. And so it was, but it was, there was a bit of a question in my mind as to whether I would be able to do it and whether I would be equal to the task. And then I worked around that problem by looking at Gail's work afresh. I told them that I would not be able to rush a tribute to them in 24 hours. But if they gave me 10 days or 12 days, then I would be able to write something, and which they did. And so I spent the next 12 days rereading. I had read Gail, of course, over the last 30 years. Each time she had a new work. And when you read it in the context in which she writes, it gives you a very different sense from the sense it gives you when you are located now and look back at 30 years of writing. I mean, the wealth of that corpus is kind of revealed to you in very, very different ways if you view it in retrospect and as a corpus. And so that is what I did. I wrote, I have written a couple of pieces from that, as a result of the reading that I did immediately after she passed away. One has been published, the shorter one has been published, and the longer one will be published in December. And so I present to you, Pushpendra asked if I would speak about this after reading what I had written. And I thought that it would certainly be a pleasure for me to share my reading of Gail Omvedt, because there are several of you who are very well acquainted with her work and have, like me, read it over the years as and when it has emerged. But there are also very young people, young students, young scholars who are new to her work and may have read parts of it or the more recent parts of it, but are not really conversant with the long durée engagements that she has had over the past 40 or more years. And so I will share what I have written, and we could have a discussion on it. My primary objective, of course, in writing this or in agreeing to, agreeing to do a retrospective reading of Gail was that it would certainly help research scholars, young and old, to reconnect with the concepts and theoretical constructs that we are working with today, as well as to connect what Gail has written to the work that we do and to the work that other people around us are doing across the world. Because things change very rapidly, but there are things that remain quite the same, as I discovered afresh when I read Gail's work. So the essay that I wrote is called Insurgent Chronicles of Revolutionary Praxis, Reading Gail Omvedt. What is revolution? How might we understand its social character, its histories and trajectories? How might we recognize revolutionaries and revolutionary action? What is the relationship between action and theory in the conceptualization of the idea of the revolution? What are the signposts of revolutionary utopias? And the idea of a utopia was very central to Gail's writing, especially in the later phases. What are its material, socio-historical, and spatio-temporal contexts? Are we talking about the third world? Are we talking about the global south? Are we talking about a binary between the north and the south? Are we talking about intersections in globality? How do revolutionary solidarities evolve across space and time? What is the place of deliberative dialogue, contentious debate, and disagreement in the forging of larger, more encompassing revolutionary solidarities? And we are at a place today where there is really no space for disagreement or dissent. In this, her work is even more important. Gail Omvedt's work is animated by questions on the inner worlds of revolution. This is evident from her very early writing on women's struggles and feminist action in the 1970s. And that was the period between 1975 and very early 1990, when she had a number of essays that talked about the Indian women's movement, the question of patriarchy in India, the specific articulations of Dalit Bahujan women in struggle, and reviewed the works of international scholars. I was introduced to the work of Gerda Lerner, The Creation of Patriarchy, through a review that Gail Omvedt did. So there was an engagement on her side with feminist writing that was emerging in the West, and the specificities of women's organizing and mobilization in India. From about the late 1980s and the 1990s particularly, we see that she has moved, while keeping her concerns on feminist organizing and on rural women's struggles, She has moved to looking much more centrally at anti-caste philosophies, politics, and movements. And this is a preoccupation that continues right till the end. But this is not to say that she was not looking at anti-caste philosophies in the earlier period. What happened was that she begins with anti-caste philosophies, but she simultaneously engages with feminism at the global and at the local level. And then she shifts back to anti-caste philosophies and the politics of organizing, particularly among Dalit Bahujan communities. And you see less of her engagement with the feminist movement or feminist politics per se by the time we move to the early 1990s. Reading her writing as it emerged in different contexts over 5 decades gives us a sense of Omvedt's deep immersion as an interlocutor of mass struggles and the shifts in her position in relation to the larger debates on specific questions at specific historical moments. For instance, feminism, struggles for land and water, ecological struggles, struggles against Hindu majoritarianism, among others. When we revisit her corpus now, sitting as we are in the belly of an ascendant Hindu supremacist regime, we realize quite in a stunning fashion the power of her insurgent and passional chronicles of revolutionary praxis. These chronicles journey through historical and social contexts in search of meaning, purpose, and exemplars, importantly, exemplars that will help us combat our troubled present in India today, especially the rise of militant Hinduism and Hindutva. She underscores the urgency of the revolutionary project, and I quote, "Out of the pleasantries of the official ideology of Hindu pluralism and tolerance, and under the pressures of contemporary material deprivation and economic turbulence, has grown the modern politics of Hindutva militant Hinduism, Hinduism as nationalism." It makes a simple addition to the claim that Hinduism is the main religion of the people of India. Hinduism's great virtue was its generous tolerance of other faiths, but its enemies have taken advantage of this. Hindus must now be strong, fierce, and proud, and not hesitate to assert themselves, unquote. Dalit resistance in Gail's framework, Dalit resistance to caste, rooted in contexts then, hold the key to understanding the history and possibilities of revolutionary praxis, and especially so in this context of a rising Hindu militancy. In mapping revolutionary praxis, indeed in mapping revolution itself, Omvedt presents congregations of the exemplars. Buddha, Kabir, Ravidas, Tukoba, Jyotiba Phule, Ayodhi Das, Periyar, Ramabai, Ambedkar, and the groundswell of resistance of Dalit and Bahujan women that was unceasing and fearless throughout the period that she was writing and engaged in movements. In doing this, she illuminates the multiple cadences of enlightenment. And we see this especially in Seeking Begumpura, but we also see it in her other works. The multiple cadences of enlightenment on the subcontinent that represented a philosophical cascade that, in her words, surpassed the European Enlightenment that followed. And this is a claim she makes in Seeking Begumpura. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity in the Indian imaginary that she posited were ideals liberated from the thraldom of caste and visions that could be traced back historically, connecting the emergence of Buddhism, for instance, to the birth of Narayana, led by Dr. Ambedkar. See especially her Seeking Begumpura. Into the present through literature, performance, and the crafting of protest in unprecedented ways, and culture and cultural expression, particularly cultural expression that has been part of the Dalit movement, has been a major area of interest where Gail was concerned. From her constructive critique of urban autonomous feminism in the early years, to her incessant multiple threads of interrogation of Marxist frameworks to understand India, we must remember her intervention in the mode of production debates, to her chronicling of the resistance to Hinduism on the subcontinent. It is this that renders Indian history intelligible. The ways in which Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, peasants, workers, primarily rural, mostly women, fought untiringly for equality and dignity through struggles for land and water, against untouchability, for fair wages, for access to places of worship, and to natural resources. The pathways to spirituality, belonging, and a higher purpose, crafted from below by Dalit Bahujan peoples, that is materially rooted and not mediated by Brahmanical Hinduism. And her whole account of the Bhakti saints and the Bhakti traditions points to this. And importantly, the anti-caste interrogation of the state ruling class next. Gail Omvedt was mindful of the diverse social character of anti-caste resistance historically, presenting in the process a situated perspective on the significance of standpoint to theorizing and resisting the oppressions of caste. And we could recall here, for instance, Nira Yuval Davis's exciting work on what she calls the situated politics of belonging. But Gail is doing the same thing within the Indian context at a very different time. I quote from Gail, Dalit politics, the Dalit vision, in fact, requires going beyond even the term Dalit. In the last decades, this has become the most widely accepted word for the most oppressed and exploited sections of the caste system. But others, like the other backward classes, the other backward castes, the former Shudras, the non-Brahmins generally, have also been oppressed and exploited within the graded hierarchy which Ambedkar called caste. They have also contributed to the fight against it. Some of the most profound expressions of a Dalit vision have come from those who were not strictly Dalit themselves. People like Phule, Periyar, Kabir, Tukoba, even for that matter, Buddha himself, who represents the starting point of a long journey towards social equality and social justice, unquote. This, for me, was a very significant point that Gail was making in terms of building bridges in the fight to resist caste. As this suggests, Maitri, the Buddhist value of Maitri, conviviality, in other words, is the pivot of the anti-caste imagination, which is built on the struggles for the annihilation of caste and an equalitarian social order that resist violence and dispossession, everyday, routine, and exceptional structural violence, and systemic and systematic dispossession along intersecting axes. In confronting violence and in attempting to break the fetters that annihilate the oppressed castes, their politics of organizing reveals complex intersections between movements, ideologies, and politics as lived. There are crossings, intersections, silos, rigidities, and fluidities that enhance or curtail the possibilities of social movements historically. In her insurgent accounts of the various sites of movement politics, and she actually immerses herself in several different struggles over her entire lifetime, Omvedt opens out to view the stunning yet fraught nature of these debates and politics. It was never an easily resolved contestation in the political arena. In Reinventing Revolution, which she published in 1993, for instance, she looks at the discrete struggles and continuities between Naxalbari, Dalit Panthers, farmers' movements, women's movements, and ecological movements, and addresses the question of whether new social movements have arrived. That's the word she uses. And I quote, hardly, meaning hardly have they arrived, she says. For the caste oppression, patriarchy, loot of peasants' labor, and natural resources, drought, and environmental destruction that they have protested against goes on. The parties, left and center, keep backtracking and betraying their promises. And the movements can get no direct representation in the party structure and have failed to form an alternative political front of their own. The preeminence of traditional Marxism among the opposition has been shaken up by the slogans and theories raised by the activists of the new movements. Yet, no new alternative, no differently articulated version of socialism has as yet emerged as a political force. The new social movements have thus arrived on the threshold of an alternative model of politics and development, but they are as yet unable to cross it, while the unmapped terrain beyond is barely discernible. So there is an angst and an impatience in the way in what she sees as a point at which new social movements seem to have got somewhat stuck. So what is the way of organizing and what are the strategies that are necessary to actually price it out and move forward? In observing these movements from the inside, as an activist deeply invested in their gains and losses on the ground, Omvedt simultaneously embarks on a heuristic project of bridging the theoretical divide between the theory and the practice of resistance. And there was really no division or no separation in her work, nor in her mind between the two. She entered into intense academic debates on Marxism, the mode of production, women's liberation, and the distinction between peasant, agricultural labor, and farmer, for instance, dwelling on the centrality of lived experience to theory. And we see Professor Gopal Guru making this point as well. How do we put experience at the center of theory, particularly if one looks at the experience of exclusion and untouchability and what that does to our conceptualization of theoretical frameworks of Indian society more generally. Take, for instance, her use of the term peasant movements, where she argues that although some prefer to call it a farmers' movement, no such distinction between farmer and peasant can be made in Indian languages, she argues, which speak only of Kisan, Raitu, Khedu, Shetkari, etc. And I quote, "Whatever the spread of market forces and the changing orientation of the Indian peasants, they continue to have their social and historical roots in a tradition that has persisted for thousands of years," unquote. Therefore, she says, she continued and preferred to use the term peasant. Or we can take her recognition, for instance, that, I quote, "Rural and toiling women's struggles occurred in many places, but they did not always yield a feminist articulation." So the nuanced and layered ways in which she saw political participation on different grounds of struggles is extremely valuable to our experience. And for me, particularly as a feminist, researcher, this sentence that rural and toiling women's struggles, which occurred, and she is a chronicler of those struggles as well, which occurred in many places, did not always yield a feminist articulation. We also find that she says, in her description of them as early feminists who struggled against patriarchy. And she uses the term sexual terrorism to describe the anticipation of violence that curtailed women's physical mobility. And she uses sexual terrorism in 1993, whereas sexual terrorism, the first time use of that word that I encountered was, apart from this, was in 1999, used by feminist philosopher Cherise Crameret. But what one sees, and what I found particularly exciting, in Gail's work is the way in which she seamlessly traverses history. So she's actually seeing early feminist articulation in late 19th century feminists, and she is seeing that large mass women's mobilization, while it's extremely important in the present, need not always and at all times yield what she calls a feminist articulation. So there is this tension. What is a feminist articulation? What is the essence of feminist articulations that needs to manifest in order for Gail to actually call a particular political mobilization feminist? You know, so and that tension for me is also a tension that has beset women's movements and feminist scholarship. For instance, the early distinction between strategic and practical gender needs and strategic interests. So, but Gail is revisiting, or rather turning that binary between practical and strategic interests on its head by going counter-historically and identifying the strategic in early resistors and identifying what might tentatively be classified as the practical in later contemporary movements. Drawing on Marlene Dixon's argument, and I quote from Omvedt, that women are the focus of every contradiction, Omvedt outlines the paradoxes and contradictions, and I'm quoting her again, the paradoxes and contradictions involved in women's position in Indian society, and the situation of lower class and lower caste women, which is in many ways different from that of upper class women. Unquote. In a complex and graded society like India, she argues, I quote, it is necessary to do more than analogize that women are an oppressed class, a caste, or a colonized group. It is necessary to see the position of women, the degree and nature of female subordination as varying from class to class, ethnic group to ethnic group, and differing according to the type of society. And we know that Uma Chakravarti, for instance, drawing on Ambedkar, has written extensively on what she calls graded patriarchies. We see an early articulation, and what I just read is from an article of Gail's published in 1975. In the Indian case, there are interacting factors, and this is the term she uses for intersections or intersectionality, as you like. In the Indian case, there are interacting factors that bolster the perpetuation of women's oppression. The persistence of caste, which carries vastly different implications for upper and lower class women, the interaction between these realities and the institutions of modern India, the influence and footprints of the West in India, and finally, the gains of centuries-long anti-caste resistance and the freedom struggle. So there she goes, trying to bring it all together, but she's not bringing all of this together in the 2000s. She has brought all of this together in 1975 and written about it in 1975. I quote, "The greatest barriers to the full liberation of Indian women today," she wrote, "lie not so much in the survivals of caste orthodoxy or patriarchalism, as in the continuing socioeconomic inequalities that make it impossible for lower class women to capitalize on the democratizing gains of the nationalist period," unquote. This is also from 1975. In studying social movements and tracing their genealogies to utopian imaginations, Omvedt, a feminist with an unswerving Dalit Bahujan standpoint, traced the layered ways in which contemporary political formations understood and accommodated women's oppression, feudal regimes, and caste orders into their articulations of politics and their critiques of power. Her critical assessments of the left in India in 1985, the Satyashodak Communist Party led by Sharad Patil, and his formulation of Marxism, Phule Ambedkarism, on which Gail writes in 1990, the Shetkari Sangatana led by Sharad Joshi, of which Gail writes in 1993, and her foundational role in the Shramik Mukti Dal. All of these point to the ways in which she has actively intervened in politics in the making to try and inject a feminist consciousness into popular mass struggles. The fact that women were the drivers of mass struggle was empirically indefeasible, acknowledged by men in these movements. And I quote, "Time and time again, male organizers of various left parties testified to the fact that women were the most militant," unquote. She recounts a description by Partha Mukherjee of a major confrontation in Naxalbari in 1967 after 2 women and a policeman died the previous day. And I quote, "One such village meeting was scheduled to be held in Prosadu Jyote, largely at the initiative of women folk who reacted sharply to the death of 2 women the previous evening. At this juncture, the SDO's police party was confronted by a babel of screaming women, abusing them in unspeakable language. The overall impression one gets is that the police insisted on going ahead and the women insisted on their returning back, fearing that otherwise their menfolk would be arrested." This is Partha Mukherjee, quoted by Gail Omvedt. Of the 10 people who died, 7 were women. Gail Omvedt observes, after this quote from Partha Mukherjee, and I quote, "The militancy of the women thus played a significant part in the historic Indian revolt." And then she adds a subtext. "Although by the 1980s, Mukherjee's description of them shouting at their oppressors as babble would have been targeted as male chauvinism." So she's also holding scholars to account and scholarship to account. Even while there were structural limitations to and contentious debates around the politics of these alternative political formations, Sharad Patil's strikingly negative, and I'm quoting her, strikingly negative conception of women's power and of sexuality unbound by patriarchy, unquote, which represents a great psychological fear of the female power principle, for instance. Omvedt underscores the praxeological significance of Sharad Patil's treatise on Dasa Sudra slavery and his move to add ending women's slavery to his Satyashoda Communist Party's goal of ending caste as indispensable to a democratic revolution, with property rights and sexuality being core concerns. So even while leaders of movements seem to hold on to some primordial patriarchal instinct, if one can call it that, they were still persuaded and forced to incorporate feminist sensibilities into their public or political program. Likewise, also, her deep engagement with Sharad Joshi and the Shetkari Sangatana, the subject of animated debates and disagreements, especially on Joshi's stand on neoliberal globalization, focuses on the Sangatana's specific articulations of women's liberation within the larger peasant struggle. Notably, the role of the Shetkari Mahila Aghadi in stressing that women were the primary constituents of the Sangatana, and I quote, "because women were the most exploited section of peasants," 1990. The 1986 Chandwad conference, which saw participation of over 1 lakh peasant women, reverberated with the slogan, "The liberation of women and men through the awakening of women's power." It is a Marathi slogan, and I'm sorry I don't speak Marathi. In the Shramik Mukti Dal that Omvedt co-founded with Bharat Patankar, their perspective on women was ahead of any other left party. By Omvedt's account, unless the struggle for a classless, casteless society free of women's oppression was achieved, women would continue to remain exploited. The Shramik Mukti Dal, therefore, focused on all 3 liberatory aspects for the overall liberation of humanity: class, caste, and women's oppression. Importantly, within the Shramik Mukti Dal, the movement of Parityakta women, abandoned, divorced, deserted, or single women, from rural and small town-based groups cascaded into demands on the state for economic support and social legitimation for women who live outside the family. This is at a time when we have the Supreme Court till today singing pains to the patriarchal monogamous family. While this was a time that also witnessed the autonomous women's movement and feminism on an ascendant in India, Omvedt reiterates through all her accounts that the revolutionary cascade was constituted by Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi women who absorbed in significant measure an intersectional feminist sensibility, and intersectional is the word I use here to describe her scholarship, an intersectional feminist sensibility that was rooted in their life worlds, even while it held lessons for movements worldwide. In her words, and I quote, "Women in movements of agricultural and poor peasantry did not simply come forward as disembodied representatives of a class." And this is Omvedt writing again in 1975. So there are several parts of her work that were extremely prescient and that anticipated debates and feminist discourse 30 years prior to their emerging as the central point of feminist discourse. All through her published work, Gail Omvedt names co-travelers with whom she has agreed, disagreed, and collaborated to varying degrees. She provides a counterpoint to reductionist readings of Dalit struggles and to rural women's militancy with respect to land and water, looking from drought-prone Marathwada outwards, always that lens from Kasegaon outwards. In her words, I quote, "I'm casting my conclusion in general terms, but rely for much of my information on very localistic data, in this case, field research in Maharashtra." She was writing in 1975, but if you look at her writing in the last decade as well, you will find that this remains central to her method, both of organizing and scholarship, locating herself within a general theoretical discourse, while simultaneously being situated in a very specific locale, which had very, very specific ecological and social characteristics. Over 5 decades, from the late 1960s to till about 2017, she looked for ways of understanding Western theory in relation to Dalit Bahujan revolutionary praxis and the ways in which the Dalit Bahujans reinvented the idea of revolution. So you find that she has, in fact, reviewed several works of Western scholars. I named Gerda Lerner's creation of Patriarchy as a text that I was introduced to through her review. It was only after her review that I acquired a copy of the book. The second was Morton Klass's little discussed work on caste, which again she opened out to view, suggesting that it held theoretical possibilities for a very different kind of understanding of caste. Omvedt also constantly urged intellectuals especially to step out of comfort zones and grapple with the intense complexity of questions of liberalization, privatization, globalization that she calls LPG, reservations in the private sector, and the specific predicament of Adivasis and access to natural resources in this context. She was part of a large debate on globalization, and I don't have the time at this point to go into it, and I haven't gone into those details in my writing either. She voiced what she called, and I quote, "some rather politically incorrect thoughts," unquote, because, as she put it, and I quote, "issues have to be grappled with, not dismissed. The only meaningful question is, for a Marxist or Dalit or feminist activist, what advances the revolution? That is, the movement towards a non-caste, non-patriarchal, equalitarian, and sustainable socialist society." So there are many, many signposts of the revolution that she is talking about. And there are many, many movements that she is addressing simultaneously. as she continues, I continue to take this as a goal, but feel we need a little more of what Phule, Ambedkar, Tukaram, Kabir, the Buddha, and Karl Marx himself saw as independent thinking. So her preoccupation with exemplars, which was the point that I started off with, it is through the exemplars and through the congregations, the movements in which the exemplars were at the center. It is through the exemplars and the congregations of the exemplars that she arrives at the sensibilities for an anti-caste society, or for a casteless society, or even for a movement for the annihilation of caste. In their recent work on intersectionality, sociologists Patricia Hill Collins and Serma Bilge trace the emergence of the concept of intersectionality to the early Black feminist articulations of the interlocked oppressions of race, gender, and class in the United States of America, as also to Savitribai Phule's articulation of caste and gender in colonial India. And this is a recent book, 2016, called Intersectionality. They thus extend the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who Kimberly Crenshaw is acknowledged as the person who first coined the word intersectionality in a 1991 essay. What Collins and Bilge do is that they extend the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who first proposed the concept as a social justice construct in the US, and they extend this concept, this social justice construct, geographically and historically. Now, writing in the 1970s and 1980s, and closely familiar with African-American feminist struggles, and closely familiar with Dalit movements, Omvedt's work in India from the mid-1970s at least, in fact, presages Crenshaw's work in the US, which is in 1991, focusing as it does on the interlocking oppressions of caste, gender, and violence against women. And I quote, "We need to look at the different forms of violence confronted by different sections of women, the relationship between violence and caste, class, rural-urban divisions, nationality, and other forms of division among women. Questions of the interrelationship between violence, exploitation, and sexuality, and their patterning among different social sections of women go to the heart of the question of violence against women." This, the quintessence of the concept of intersectionality, Gail writes about in 1990. Crenshaw uses the word intersectionality for precisely this kind of articulation in 1991. While she references several Western scholars in her work, she does not engage, Omvedt does not engage with the concept of intersectionality, despite the strong praxeological overlap. If it is a social justice construct, it is a praxeological overlap, not just a theoretical overlap. By the early 1990s, when Crenshaw wrote, and this is what I suggest, why doesn't Omvedt engage with the concept of intersectionality when she has engaged with feminist writing in or Western feminist scholarship in the earlier years? And my suggestion is that by the early 1990s, when Crenshaw wrote, Omvedt had shifted quite substantively to questions of rural struggles, agrarian crisis, and anti-caste philosophies, where she continued to observe women's engagement in resistance, but was less involved in international feminist debates. Yet, her work offers rich possibilities for scholars interested in the genealogies of intersectionality and their relevance in understanding Dalit Bahujan women's radicalism. So also, the case with the articulations of decolonial imaginations that challenge power at every level and at every site, in India particularly, the colonizing juggernaut of Hindutva. We also have debates globally today, particularly 2020 and after, on what is called the Second Convivialist Manifesto, proposed by the Convivialist International, and they were up for signatures all of last year. The Declaration of Independence in the manifesto sets out the normative theoretical position for human cooperation, solidarity, equal human dignity, and the necessity of its social realization. And the necessity of its social realization is what is referred to as convivialism, as well as its lived praxis, which is referred to by the word conviviality. In her work, both published and political, Maitri, which interweaves convivialism and conviviality, has been at the center of Gail Omvedt's universe. This is a concept that has its roots in anti-caste philosophies and Dalit Bahujan Adivasi revolutionary praxis. Engaging with the futures of the Convivialist Manifesto from the vantage point of Gail's work and her preoccupations, therefore, may yield important insights into organizing against strident right-wing nationalism and politics in India and internationally. And I conclude, in her intense engagements with political, literary, and academic publics within and outside India, Gail Omvedt saw herself as an interlocutor, a messenger who carried forth the message of the annihilation of caste and the vision of the Dalit Bahujan revolution as the exemplar of revolutions. So we move from exemplars and their congregations to the revolution itself as an exemplar of revolution. So the questions that I raised in the opening in terms of what is revolution is, I respond to those questions in this last concluding lines, which is that for Gail, the vision of the Dalit Bahujan revolution was the exemplar of the revolution itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kalpana. And now the floor is open for Q&A session. You can also put your questions in the chat box, or you can ask directly.
Sir, please unmute.
Sorry. Now, my question to you is her views on the Telangana movement, particularly when you are there. And I know that various even revolutionary groups were also involved in Telangana movement in various ways. So how did she look at these types of movement or engage with them? That's the first question.
Actually, frankly, Pushpin, from all the writing that I have looked at, I haven't actually, I'm sure she must have written, but I haven't actually come across any writing in which she has spoken about the Telangana movement per se. So I actually wouldn't be able to answer that question. But if there is somebody in the audience who has read her work on this, I think, I would be actually happy with a response from the floor as well. But it is true that particularly the radical left groups did support the idea of a separate Telangana. Also, the civil liberties group supported the idea of a separate Telangana. And there were a number of mass struggles. Adivasi groups supported the idea of separate Telangana. But what did Gail think about it? I don't know. I mean, I haven't read any reference by her to the Telangana movement.
And my another question is regarding her views on caste as a form of race. And I know that this has been criticized particularly by the liberal thinkers. And so what's your views on this?
On caste as a form of race?
Yes.
I actually, I guess I come to it from a slightly different vantage point, because I look, a lot of my work, I must clarify, a lot of my work is more squarely located within the domain of law than it is within the domain of sociology. And when I look at caste through the medium of discrimination, which is the way I do look at it, not just as a form of social organization, but as a medium of discrimination within societies. That specific articulation is what I have focused on. And if you look at it as a medium of discrimination, perhaps you can't say caste is race, but what you can certainly say is that caste and race are systems that are based on ascriptive norms of discrimination that are powered in very, very similar ways. So, if we could, of course, break it down and say, is caste race or is it not race? But to me, that debate is not very productive. What is more productive is how can we set up a conversation that looks at the relationship between caste and race. And for me, the relationship between caste and race in the course of my own work has been to look at both through an understanding of non-discrimination and through the inevitability of ascriptive caste, in a caste-ordered society. Yeah. So what does the resistance to caste mean, and what is the place of discrimination in combating, what's the place of discrimination in obstructing the resistance to caste? So if you look at it from that standpoint, you will see too many parallels to say that caste is not race. You can say that caste and race are both forms of descent-based discrimination, which is the framework of the Durban Conference and the Convention Against Racism. That the idea then is to map a form of discrimination of which both are part, rather than to say this is equal to that or not.
We have question from Lavanya Suresh. Lavanya, if you can unmute yourself.
Hi, ma'am. I love the talk. Thank you so much. It was very rich. I was wondering if you can expand further on her reflections on revolutionary struggles by women in terms of access to land and water.
Right from her very early work on women's struggles, her focus has been on the mass participation of rural Dalit, Bahujan, landless, women belonging to rural Dalit, Bahujan communities who are largely landless, in a struggle for land and water. I mean, these were the preoccupations. And this is not in any one particular writing of hers. You will see this figuring right through across her writing. And in all of that writing, while she, whether she is looking at her engagements with Sharad Patil or Sharad Joshi, or her work in the Shramik Mukti Dal, or her work with the left parties, what you will find is that she is constantly preoccupied with forcing political formations that are organized around mass struggles for land and water and equitable distribution of land and water. She is forcing these struggles to reckon with the defining presence of women in these struggles. And that, in fact, for me, is the most powerful part of her work.
Anybody else who would like to raise any question?
Yeah, there's somebody, Nitin has said that she has written extensively about Andhra Pradesh. Yes, of course. I have read Dalits and the Democratic Revolution, and she has written extensively on Andhra Pradesh. But I think the question was specifically whether she supported the demand for a separate Telangana. On that, I don't have an answer. So that was my clarification.
You talked about this, say, revolution, the idea of revolution. And one question which always comes to my mind, in fact, two questions related. One is that, say, Ambedkar accepted this, what we call liberal bourgeois democratic structure, and he wrote drafted the constitution for this, this kind of, say, democratic structure. How did she reconcile with the kind of idea of revolution which she had with this kind of liberal democratic structure? That's the first question I have. And then the related is also, as an atheist, I find it also difficult. I understand that masses will be believers, or they will have their own faith. But how can a person who is a non-believer can reconcile with this idea that we have to say, base our various ideas of change and revolution and change in say these saints, particularly non-Brahminical, those who belong to non-Brahminical traditions?
Sorry, I'm just getting distracted between the chat box and the questions.
Okay. And then you give priority to
I'm not going to do the chat box now.
Yeah.
You know, on the question of spirituality and her use of exemplars, you know, I must say that she is simultaneously looking at several political formations. One large part of her work was to look at you know, at the anti-caste philosophers, some of whom were located within a larger spiritual context, others not. But the space of anti-caste resistance itself is quite wide and quite diverse, and she is you know, she is foregrounding the exemplars from different traditions. And in foregrounding those exemplars from different traditions, we must remember that she also has a finger on the pulse of the women that she is working with and the constituencies that she is organizing in. And I'm certain that you know, the idea of exploring questions of an insurgent spirituality also occurred to Gail from her experience of working with mass organizations and large numbers of women, where faith is never outside the pale. There is a way in which you practice faith insurgently. You topple you topple the mediators of religion, and isn't the whole bhakti tradition about that in any case? And so she is trying to understand the source of the source and the texture of the moral fiber of the women who are resisting at enormous personal cost. And I think that is where she begins to look really seriously at the question of who the exemplars are, what is the place of spirituality in political organizing, you know, what is the place of Dr. Ambedkar's Diksha in the larger, you know, within the larger Ambedkarite politics, and so on. So I do think that there isn't, like, even in her writing, one answer for all, but then she is proposing very, very different sets of, you know, very, very different pathways to the revolution that are taken by different political formations at different times. On Dr. Ambedkar's participation in the Constitution, you know, I myself have worked very, very closely. I haven't actually seen a single reference from Gail to the Constitution per se, you know, I mean, to law and the constitution making. There is a large focus on rights for sure, and for resistance in order to assert rights, particularly to dignity. And again, dignity is a concept that's linked to the larger notion of spirituality and not linked to it as well. So she is talking about the rights to dignity, the rights to livelihood, the rights to land and natural resources. And she is engaging with Dr. Ambedkar's work in the broadest possible terms, extensively and intensively. But that's not the same thing as engaging with his specific work on constitution drafting. That's quite another thing altogether. And I haven't, like I said, I may have missed it, but I haven't come across her writing that reflects directly on, the process of the making of the Indian Constitution. Yeah. But on Dr. Ambedkar's engagement itself, a very short point that, I don't know. I mean, there is this argument, of course, that, it is a liberal constitution and how do you reconcile yourself to it? But I think that what started off as a liberal constitution, or what was couched in liberal terms, in fact, has very, very strong doses of anti-caste philosophy and of the arguments for a plural culture that are not within that liberal framework, and I've written about this elsewhere when I've written in my recent work on the Constitution itself, where I've looked particularly at three people, Baba Saheb Ambedkar, Maulana Azad, and Jaipal Singh Munda. Yeah. And what were the sensibilities that these three people brought to the Constitution, and how has the Constitution been actually forged through this very, very intense intellectual and political debate within the subcontinent on the character of the future Indian society. Yeah. So I wouldn't be quick to dismiss even Ambedkar's engagement with constitution making as a liberal democratic framework alone. Yeah, I would see it as rooted in resistance in a very different way. Particularly if you look at the provisions that ban untouchability, if you look at Article 15, the non-discrimination clause, particularly 15.2. There, you can see the sensibilities of anti-caste philosophies are completely all over the Constitution.
Professor Devi Prasad?
Devi Prasad. Well, this is what connections did she see between Buddha, Karl Marx, Ambedkar, Kabir is a really broad question. Yeah. I can suggest her writings to you, and you can actually look at how she develops an argument that threads these together. But I don't think I can answer that question here. In fact, a lot throughout my talk, what I was trying to do was to thread together those different pieces of her work.
Meera Bhunesh, can you actually clarify your question?
I would actually be more comfortable with that.
Good evening, Professor. It was a very good talk. Thank you so much. My question is, if you can shortly just elaborate, because I'm intrigued like a student, from an American outsider to a revolutionary insider. I mean, can you just shortly elaborate? How was she able to understand the complexities of Indian society, see religion, caste, gender? It's very complex for even an Indian to understand it.
I wouldn't even hazard a speculation on that. Because nobody can answer it except Gail, and I don't want to hazard a guess. But if you see in what I have written, I have very consciously avoided what I call the binary trap. Whether American outsider to Indian insider or white to Dalit. I think binaries obfuscate more than they explain. What is important to me is that she was a scholar who lived in India for close to 5 decades, for whom India was home, who was a close observer of scholarship worldwide, including in the US, where she spent the first 2.5 decades of her life. Attempted to understand the realities of both in relation to each other. And she was constantly, and I think one of the things that I also attempted to do in my talk is to demonstrate the ways in which she constantly straddled the global and the local, or the international and the locally specific, and the politics of organizing and practice and theory. So in her, I mean, in the work that Gail has put out, both politically within the movement and in her writing, what she has done is precisely to wipe out these binaries. So, we would, in fact, I feel, be doing a great disservice to her if we erect the binaries back again, because she has, in fact, spent a lifetime wiping those binaries out.
Shashank?
Hello.
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Professor Kalpana, for such illuminating talk and some thought-provoking arguments which you have posed. Now, before formally ending the session, I would like to invite Professor Pushpen to give his concluding remarks, and then we will end this session.
Oh, no concluding remarks here.
Or whatever if you want to say something.
Yes. So what I would like to say is to profusely thank Professor Kalpana Kannabiran. It happened that she sent her write-up, which was published in India Forum, and I saw that, and then we had a conversation, and then it was agreed that we will get it translated into Hindi, which we did actually, and that's how this engagement started. And then she also told that she was writing for a long piece on this for social change, and then I thought, why not lecture here to understand the views of, and not only views, but also her engagement with the grassroots. So that's how the idea of the lecture came, and Professor Kalpana Kannabiran immediately agreed to the lecture. So thank you very much for accepting and this enlightening lecture. And this also a way to celebrate, as I said in the beginning, the life of Gail Omvedt, which is so important. And it's reading her is such a pleasure. My favorite book is The List and the Democratic Revolution, where she discusses in detail even the movement in Andhra Pradesh against Rajakars, the communist movement, the Communist Party, and their over-assessment, the kind of zeal and the optimism which is so perennial in that stream, where you tend to also to neglect the realities on the ground, and so all the issues related to strategies of revolution which we were started with. So, and then there actually that's the book which I found that it's a kind of is a blending Marxism with ideas of Ambedkar and Phule and others, and where she has actually engaged with the historical materialism, but she has modified it, and this is what she also says. So that's the blending which I find. And of course, each of the writings are different, and they take up different issues and different ideas. And I would also accept that for the first time, this term new social movement, I read from her book.
Yes.
Okay, and then we also had, say, A.K. Roy in Jharkhand, the trade union leader, who wrote about this new social movements, particularly because they were engaging with informal labor in 80s. And that time, this idea of new social movements were emerging. And in the communist parties, it was when I was a full-timer. And there it was looked at very skeptically. that these movements, women movement, this all talks about environment, ecology. These are people were very skeptical about it. Youth movement. And so there was one, say, understanding about what youth should be doing, what the students should be doing, how should they become part of revolutionary movement, but what to do with the youth who are interested in different issues, and how to make those issues part of larger, say movement or larger revolutionary framework. That was a question which Communist parties were actually grappling with. Unfortunately, we didn't read these books those days. We should have, actually.
Yes.
Yeah, but one thing was perhaps we were also in action, so there was very less opportunity to read. The internet was not available, so books were not easily available. And also, but somewhere, I think more than that, the reservations or the skepticism which we had, perhaps that prevented us from reading and understanding. So it happens now in sociology. What we always say that start with the reality rather than start with your own thinking, understanding about the reality. And so you start from above because you are guided by an ideology, and you start explaining things without observing them. And here there is a new method. This is the method where she lives in a village, she observes, she engages with people, and then she tries to theorize. So it's this praxis and the combination of theory and practice, which we learned from Gail Omvedt. Still, I feel we are very fortunate that she decided to live in India. She lived here, she engaged with movements, she gave us all these books, not only books, pamphlets, booklets. I have a few booklets of her which were translated. I think originally some of the booklets were written in Marathi and translated into English, and a few in Hindi also. So these kind of writings which we got, and then that has expanded our understanding about Indian society and different societies, I would say, not only here. So you understand from that writing, you understand the history, what happened there, and also you understand about different places. And it's not just the time of the past, but also say the movement, Dalit movement in Bihar. If I work here, so we have not experienced that kind of Dalit movement, which is there very strong in Maharashtra or in several other parts of India. So this is the time to, so today we thought remembering Gail Omvedt, but with your scholarly lecture. So thanks again. And I would like to thank everyone who is present here. And I know during the lecture also, I was getting messages that people were finding difficult to log in. There was some problem, I think, perhaps maybe some typing mistake which I made. So thanks to everyone. And I think I will inform people, those who have missed, they can go to TISS YouTube channel and they can watch the entire lecture again. And then thanks to my also TISS Patna team members and TISS Mumbai, also the director and others who circulated about this lecture to all faculty members, to all students and all PhD scholars. So thank you, everyone. I think this is time to now say bye.
Thank you very much.